Of our minutes from February 6th. Is there a motion?
Second.
All in favor? Aye. And we will take the next item for discussion, review of police complaints. Did anyone have any questions? I believe Chief Eddington is here. Were there any questions or comments? There being none, except for what Chief Eddington wanted to report.
I have nothing to add at this time. Thank you.
Right. Well, thank you very much. Next item for consideration, we're going to jump to HH2, which is Ordinance 27012, an ordinance amending Section 10313 of the Evanston City Code, use of mobile telephones while operating a motor vehicle. We have a number of speakers who want to address the committee at this time, and we'll take the speakers first, and then there's a formal presentation. Mr. Timothy Schoolmaster. And after, you'd like to come later? Great. Sure. Should we see the presentation first, or would you like? All right. Then we'll start with the presentation, if we may. Mr. David Teeter from the National Safety Council, which is based in Itasca. And I must say that it was about a year ago in April 2011 that we convened a distracted driving summit at Evanston Township High School to note kind of the one-year anniversary of our handheld ban, and Mr. Teeter was among the panelists who testified and presented information and expertise at that summit, as well as Sergeant Thomas Moore, who's here tonight, and Barb Carnew from the Active Transportation Alliance, and she's here as well tonight. So thank you again for coming back to Evanston to offer your expertise and perspective on this issue. So, Mr. Teeter.
Thank you. I thank the committee for your interest in this. I thank all of you who showed up tonight. I want to take a few minutes and give you some background on the issue of cell phone distracted driving specifically, and then I'd be happy to answer any questions either before or after the other comments. This is an issue that's very near and dear to me. I've been working on this now full-time for about the last 4 or 5 years. Prior to that, I was in private enterprise. I worked for the auto industry. I did a lot of research, consulting, and strategic planning for the auto industry. I got interested in this subject when I read up on the research and saw how dangerous it was. I was a huge cell phone user. I had one of the very first, we called them car phones way back then. That's the only place you could get them, if you think about it. And I was shocked to find out, how distracting this is and how dangerous this is. And I was almost a little upset that the public didn't know about it. So I've spent the last several years of my life kind of informing the public. I do a lot of speaking on this issue. I do a lot of testifying on this issue. And I want to just hit some highlights. I mean, there's enough information. We could talk for hours. We're not going to do that. I'm going to hit some of the highlights and then hopefully address any specific questions you might have. Okay? First of all, a little bit about motor vehicle crashes. It's a big deal, and many of you may know this, but we've lost 1 million people in the last 25 years. We lose about 35,000 people in this country every year. If you divide that by the number of days in a year, it's about 100 people every single day die in automobile crashes. We will lose in the next 15 to 20 days the same number of Americans on our nation's roadways as we have brave young men and women in Afghanistan in the last 10 years. That'll happen in the next 15 days by the end of the month. We lose, it's the equivalent of a jetliner going down every single day, and that's been going on for over 40 years. And the sad thing is the vast majority of these can be prevented. If you're between the ages of 5 and 35, you're more likely to die in a car crash than any other form of death, cancer, disease, anything. If you're between the ages of 15 and 20, you're more likely to die in a car crash than the next 3 leading causes of death combined: homicide, suicide, and cancer. It's the leading cause of accidental death in this country, both on and off the job. Society seems to become a little complacent, even though it costs society nearly $100 billion a year. Traffic crashes are a really big thing. Maybe we're a little complacent about it because if we really knew how dangerous it was every time we got in a car, we'd be scared to death. But I can't think of a higher calling of our government officials than to work and help us in protecting us in public safety. And this is certainly straight out a public safety issue. Okay, let's talk about what causes crashes. Motor vehicle crashes causes are kind of separated into 3 areas. Those of you who follow motor vehicle crash causation research know that the research is not real definitive in a lot of areas. That's why there's some debate. And it's not definitive for obvious reasons. We can't put people in cars and watch them crash and see what happens. So we have to use things like simulators. We have to try and put cameras in cars and hope people forget we're watching them and see what happens when they drive around. All of these research methodologies have limitations. The other problems, and I'm sure law enforcement will attest to this, it's hard to know exactly what happens in a crash. People either get hurt, they don't remember, they don't tell the truth. So a lot of times we don't always know exactly what happens. That's especially true with distraction. We don't have a blood alcohol content test for cell phone distracted driving. About all the police can do is say, sir or madam, were you using a cell phone when you ran the red light and caused the crash? And today we aren't sure people are being real honest about that. But the auto industry, the Auto Alliance, actually looked at causes of crashes, and they broke them into three categories. And the first is vehicle maintenance issues. We heard a lot about a particular manufacturer's brake problems a few years ago. Vehicle maintenance issues are about 10% of crashes, and the vast majority of that 10% are tire issues, improperly inflated or maintained tires. So it's a relatively small number. Environmental factors are the definite cause in about 20%, maybe as many as 33% of the crashes. That's snow, ice, visibility issues. But look at this, human error. Human error causes definitely 70% of all crashes and maybe as much as 93%. By the way, the reason you see such a range is because many times there's multiple causes of crashes. If somebody's driving in the dark, speeding on wet roads, talking on a cell phone with a 0.08 blood alcohol content, and they crash, what was the primary cause of crash? It's difficult to know precisely, so that's why you see these ranges. Okay, a lot of really smart people have been trying to protect us and do something about this, and because of this human error factor, they've really focused, especially lately, on driver inattention or distraction. And scientists who look at this put distractions in three categories. We're visually distracted when we take our eyes off the road. We're mechanically distracted when we take our hands off the wheel. And we're cognitively distracted when our mind is not engaged in the task of driving. Now consider this with me for a minute. I maintain that we know when we're visually and mechanically distracted. You know, if we're fumbling in a purse or a briefcase or a backpack in the passenger seat, we kind of know what we're doing is dangerous. We don't look into the backpack for 5-10 seconds at a time. We look for one or two, and if we don't find what we're looking for, we look back to the forward roadway. We probably shouldn't be doing it, period, but when we do, we know we're visually or mechanically distracted. We do not know, and this is very key to what we're talking about, we do not know when we're cognitively distracted. I used to drive frequently from Grand Rapids, Michigan to Detroit. We had offices in both cities. It was a 2.5-hour drive. Back in the old days when I was on a cell phone during that drive, I would hang up the phone and I wouldn't know which side of Lansing, Michigan I was on. It's right in the middle of the drive. Until I saw a road mark or something, I wouldn't know if I'd passed Lansing or not. Should have been a clue that something was going on in my head that might impact my ability to drive a car well. We've been driving cars for 125 years. We've been talking on phones for about 75. We've only combined those activities to any great degree in the last 5 or 10 years. We've never had to understand what goes on in the human brain when we're involved in a telephone conversation. We're starting to understand that now. What we're finding out is there's a huge cognitive load. You'll hear people say that we're safe as long as we keep our eyes on the road and our hands on the wheel. That is just not true, folks. We've got research after research after research that says that driving is a cognitively demanding task and our mind has to be engaged. Multitasking is a myth. The human brain does not truly multitask. If we're dealing with two cognitively demanding tasks at the same time, the brain always has to choose one as primary. A good example of cognitive distraction, how many of you can watch your favorite television show, be engaged in the plot while you talk to somebody on the phone at the same time? Most people say, I can't do that. Can't do both of them well. If we can't do that, how can we drive a 5,000-pound vehicle in an environment where everybody's safety around us depends on our ability to drive well and react to something that comes up that we have no plan that it's going to come up and react well to it if we're engaged in a telephone conversation? The answer is we can't. When our brains are overloaded with two cognitive tests, the brain always picks a primary task. And for some reason, we don't quite understand why, but the cell phone conversation takes priority over the driving task. When driving is a secondary task, certain things happen. And one of the real scary things is it actually impacts our vision. We look, but we do not see. Researchers refer to this as inattention blindness, looking straight ahead but not seeing what's in front of us. Another thing that happens is our eyes stop scanning the environment. One of the real key practices in driving safely is eye scan. We don't want you staring straight ahead and driving. We want you scanning your environment. Have you ever noticed I travel a lot? When I get off an airplane in airports, I like to watch people because everybody picks up their phone because they haven't been able to use it on the airplane. Have you watched them walking and talking on a cell phone? They're not looking around like this while they're walking. Their gaze is fixed straight ahead, and they're walking, and they aren't aware of what's around them. It's a perfect example of what happens when we're cognitively distracted. Our vision gets locked. Researchers refer to this as tunnel vision. Here's an example of what that looks like. This is actually from a naturalistic study where they had eye scans, and actually, these are people actually driving the car, and they could measure this person's eye scan movement, and that's their field of vision. That's how their eye is moving. But look what happened when the exact same person used a cell phone. Look how it narrowed down. Okay, perfect example, tunnel vision. Look what dropped out of the frame. The school bus on the left is completely gone. A pedestrian could be gone, just off the view. Their eyes have locked down because their mind is focused somewhere else. They're visually processing data that they can't see. They're imagining what the person on the other end of the phone looks like. They're using visual processing requirements, and they're not focusing on the road. Okay, why do we pick on cell phones? You know, a lot of people say there's all kinds of distractions in a car. Why are we focused on cell phones? And it's a great question. Let me see if I can explain it to you. Researchers who look at distractions come up with this fancy thing they call an odds ratio. They're trying to rank how serious a distraction is or how distracting an activity is. And you'll see these are some from various studies, but researchers will tell you that if you're reading and driving, you're 3.4 times more likely to get in a crash than if you're not reading. If you're turning around in the seat, if you're reaching for a moving object, two of the more dangerous things you can do while driving, you're almost 9 times more likely to crash. If you're talking on a cell phone, we've got more than 20 studies that have looked at this using various research methodologies, and they all seem to coalesce right around 4 times odds ratio of crashing. So in other words, if you're talking on a cell phone, you're about 4 times more likely to crash than if you weren't. If you're texting, and you'll see I've got a big range here, we only have 2 studies that have looked at it. You're either 8 or 23 times more likely to crash. My guess is as we get more studies, it'll probably fall somewhere in the middle. It's very, very dangerous, regardless. By the way, it's interesting. One of the reasons we only have 2 studies is, believe it or not, texting, which seems like it's been around forever, is a relatively new phenomenon. It's been around for a few years, really. Just a few years ago, doing this presentation with an audience of this age group, I'd have to stop now and explain to you what texting was. But it's coming on fast. Odds ratio of crashing. Risk, though, is only half the story. Believe it or not, we've got naturalistic studies where they have cameras in cars and hope people forget about them and drive. We've actually caught people changing clothes while driving down the road. You know, they're on their way to a golf match after work or a baseball game or softball game. They're changing clothes. That's off the charts risky. Don't know what the odds ratio is, but it's got to be huge. We aren't here talking about that tonight because people don't do that very often. Thank goodness. This is where cell phones have dramatically changed the landscape when it comes to distracted driving. Just like everything else in auto safety, it's kind of difficult to measure how many people are on a cell phone at any given moment. But the National Highway Transportation Safety Administration, every year, they've been doing this for 10 to 15 years, sends trained observers, usually working in groups of 3, 2 people watching, 1 person recording, to 20,000 intersections around the country, and they measure 2 things. They measure seatbelt use and cell phone use. Now, they can't tell if somebody's talking on a hands-free phone, so they'll do a representative survey. So, for example, they'll do a representative survey in Evanston, and they might say for every 1 person talking on a handheld phone, there's another 1.5 people on a hands-free phone because you have an ordinance against using a handheld phone. In some cities, it might be much less than that. But that's how they come up with what we refer to as prevalence or risk exposure. And if you look at these numbers on the bottom, these are from 2010, so they're going on 1.5 years old now. But texting in 2010 was observed at about 1 out of 100 people at any given moment. Now, you might get a lot more people than that say they text, but at any given moment, they were able to measure 1 out of 100. But look at cell phone use, conversations, almost 1 out of 10. There isn't another distraction, another activity like eating, like putting on makeup, like reaching for a moving object that we can even measure. We can't even measure it. And now we've got this activity that to any great degree didn't exist 5 or 10 years ago, where nearly 1 out of 10 people at any given moment are talking on a cell phone while they're driving. That's why this is a big deal. It's not because it's the most dangerous thing you can do while driving. There's other more dangerous things. But so many people are doing that the risk has increased dramatically. Now, if you put those two things together, if you put prevalence and degree of risk together, everything else is pure mathematics, and we can kind of come up with a pretty good assumption of how many crashes involve this activity. And the National Safety Council did that, and we believe that in 2010, about 3% of all crashes, or 150,000 crashes, involved texting. But look at this. 1.2 million crashes, or 1 out of 5, involve cell phone conversations. Now, if texting prevalence continues to increase because of how risky that activity is, these numbers will skyrocket under texting because it's an incredibly risky thing to do. But right now, when all of us drive home today, we're much more likely to get in a crash caused by a driver who's distracted by a cell phone conversation, not by texting, or any other distraction for that matter, because it's so prevalent. And that's a real key thing. If this was, I think I got my first car phone back in 1980. I think my company paid about $3,000 for it. It was this big box that mounted in the trunk with a handset on the... I couldn't use it very much because the cell towers weren't built, so they were real short phone calls. If this was back in that day, if there were only a few business people using phones for very short periods of time, we wouldn't be here talking about this today. We're talking about it today because it's become so prolific, and that combined with the risk is what's causing so many crashes. Total of, we believe, about 1 out of 4 crashes involve cell phone use. Again, an activity that did not exist to any great degree just 5 or 10 years ago, and now it's 1 out of 4 crashes. I want to go through a few studies. Some of these have been around for a while. The Insurance Institute for Highway Safety, the crash dummy people, wanted to see if there was a statistical relationship between getting hurt in a car crash and talking on a cell phone. So they hung out in emergency rooms, and when people came in who'd been hurt in a car crash but not too seriously, they put them in the study if they could get the precise moment of the crash, precise time, and if they could get their cell records. They did what's referred to as an epidemiological study, where they were actually trying to look if there's a statistical causal relationship between two variables. Here are a couple of results. First of all, these were one of the first group. This was back in 2004 that came up with an odds ratio of 4-fold. So you're 4 times more likely to get in a crash if you're talking on a cell phone. And secondly, and I think of particular interest to this committee because you're considering a total ban, the risk was exactly the same regardless of whether they were on a handheld or a hands-free phone. And they had about half in each study. This was actually done in Perth, Australia, because they couldn't get cell phone records anywhere in North America. And at the time, there was a handheld ban, so they had a lot of people using hands-free devices, a lot of people using handheld as well. These organizations, our organization, the National Safety Council, the National Transportation Safety Board, the World Health Organization, the Insurance Institute, the Governor's Highway Safety, and many others have all looked real hard at this issue of hands-free and have all come to the conclusion that hands-free does not make us safer. Not one iota. There's over 30 studies that have looked at this. There's not a single credible study that's been able to find a safety improvement for hands-free. Now think about it for a minute in light of what we just talked about. What happens when we use hands-free? We put one hand back on the steering wheel. It's the only thing that changes. We've been driving manual transmissions for years and haven't been worried about them as a safety concern. We put one hand back on the steering wheel. Now, there's some thought that maybe if you're holding the phone in your left hand, you might not check your blind spot as well. There's some thought, and probably accurate, that people who have one hand on a cell phone, the other on the wheel, aren't using turn signals as much. But when it comes to crashes, we don't see any difference between handheld and hands-free, and neither do any of the researchers who have looked at this. If you have an interest in this, we have a free download, and I think actually we sent this to you in the materials called The Distracted Brain. It's a white paper that looks at the whole issue of hands-free handheld. It also lists those 30 studies I talked about that have tried to look at it and all come up with this conclusion. This is real interesting. This is an email I just got from one of our employees in Dallas. I just want to read it to you real quickly, but she said Thursday evening, this was in February, she's in her car, stopped at a light. When the light turned green, but before the car in front of her started moving, she was hit from behind. In talking with the woman who hit me, I found that she was on her phone, but she assured me that she was driving safely because she was using her built-in hands-free system in her Lincoln SUV. She said that she saw the light was green, but guessed that for some reason she didn't notice the cars weren't moving yet. Remember the little box, the tunnel vision box? We'll move it up around the light, and you don't see any of the cars underneath it. Your gaze is fixed. Perfect example of inattention blindness. She didn't say she was looking down and dialing. In fact, she was on a hands-free phone. She said she was looking, she saw the light turn green. For some reason, she didn't see the cars directly in front of her move. We get anecdotal statements like this all the time. It's amazing. How's this compare to drunk driving? You know, it's a little bit of a controversial issue because we have had some researchers look at it. I'll give you some caveats on this, but the folks at the University of Utah took 40 adult subjects, they put them in a simulator, they had them drive a course, and they scored their performance. They took the same 40, put them in a different course because they didn't want them to learn the course, had them drive using a handheld phone, same 40, different course, hands-free phone, same 40, different course, no phone, but 0.08 blood alcohol level. So they had 4 groups to look at. Here are the results. First of all, this is another one. The hands-free and the handheld phone users drove exactly the same. There was no difference whatsoever. They scored almost identically. So they lumped them together. And then secondly, the cell phone distracted drivers had slower reaction times and got in slightly more crashes than those at the 0.08 blood alcohol level. Now, a couple of caveats on this. This is not the same as drunk driving. It's not as bad in many ways. It's more challenging in some other ways, and we don't have time to get into all of that. But there's been about 3 other studies that have looked at this. They've all only looked at the 0.08 blood alcohol level, which is the minimum threshold. And my friends in the impaired driving field say that a lot of our real serious crashes happen at much higher blood alcohol levels. And I, for a moment, am not saying, nor do I believe, that somebody at twice the legal limit is a better driver than a cell phone driver. We're not saying that. But 0.08 is the legally accepted limit. The other thing is we're not sure. Simulators are great for measuring crashes because people kind of know they can't get hurt. They might behave a little differently, but we think they're great at measuring reaction times. And by the way, the other studies that have looked at this, Car and Driver magazine did a track study. The cable show Mythbusters did a study. They all came to the same conclusion. The cell phone drivers were slightly more impaired than those at the 0.08 blood alcohol level. One last key thing to remember when we compare these two issues is remember that a cell phone driver is only impaired as long as they're on the phone, and at any given moment they can stop being impaired. The drunk driver is not. The drunk driver is drunk and impaired for the entire trip. So those are 2 pretty significant differences. But think about this for a minute. We've got 10% of all drivers at any given moment talking on a cell phone, and based on these studies, their reaction times are slower than if they were at a 0.08 blood alcohol level. That's pretty scary. The folks at Carnegie Mellon were able to combine an Fmri with a driving simulator. They wanted to look in the brain and see what was going on for the task of driving and see if anything changed when they added a phone call. The brain on the left is, that's the occipital parietal lobe, and the red part is what's lit up when a person is driving. That's the part of the brain they were using for the task of driving. Look what happened when they introduced a phone call. There was a 37% reduction in that part of the brain. Those resources went somewhere else to handle the phone call. This is a perfect example, actually a picture, of what cognitive distraction looks like. This is how the brain can't multitask at the same time. Okay, some misperceptions. Not enough evidence to prove that using a cell phone while driving causes crashes. There are not a lot of good crash data, and I'm not sure we're going to have any soon. As I mentioned earlier, there's no blood alcohol content test for distracted driving. All an officer can do is really ask a person if they were on the phone. Sometimes we can get cell records. It's very difficult to get cell records. Even if we can get them, we need to know the precise second of the crash. We don't always know that. Most municipalities, it's not illegal, so there's really no incentive to do all of this. In most municipalities where it is illegal, there's always something more serious the driver can be cited with, failure to yield. So it's just not, there's not a great way to collect these data. By the way, even with these limitations, the Department of Transportation, I think, reported 2 years ago, they reported about 3,500 fatalities, even with those limitations. And we think the number could be by an order of magnitude higher than that. One thing I want to say, though, is just because we don't have the ability to measure something doesn't mean the problem doesn't exist. Just means we haven't figured out a way to measure it well yet. And in this case, it may be a long time. We got all kinds of evidence that says it's dangerous, tons of it. We've got all kinds of crash stories where people admitted to being on the phone, or we saw people on the phone run red lights in broad daylight while looking straight ahead. So we got all kinds of evidence. We just don't have a lot of good crash statistics. No more dangerous than talking to a passenger. It's a great question. We hear it a lot. There's some key differences here. First of all, the passenger is in the same driving environment. We've never had to understand what's going on in the human brain when we're talking on the phone. We've started to learn a lot about it lately. We understand it's a much more cognitively demanding task than we ever thought of. You know, I can see this gentleman nodding his head over here. Saw someone earlier shaking their head. You know, I know what you all look like. I know how you're reacting. If we were doing this on a webinar, for example, which I do every now and then, it's much more difficult for me to do this. I have to imagine what you're all doing, thinking, talking about. If it was a two-way conversation, you're sitting across from desk from me, I can actually see you start to say something before I hear it. On the phone, I can't do that. It takes much more cognitive resources to have the exact same conversation with someone you can't see. We're just discovering that. Maybe most importantly, though, is that the passenger is in the same driving environment. When was the last time you rode in the front seat of a car and didn't pay any attention to the forward roadway? I mean, we kind of intuitively know some of those statistics I said earlier about how dangerous it is to drive. And for an adult driver, this does not apply to a teen or novice driver, but for an adult driver, one front seat passenger is actually a protective effect. It makes you safer, okay? They're helping you look out for hazards, whether you like it or not. You know, I drive down the road, and my wife and I are having a conversation, and the light suddenly turns yellow, and I got to make a decision. You know, the conversation immediately stops, and in my case, my wife helps me with that decision. Might be annoying sometimes, but actually makes me a safer driver. You know, she'll point out things that I might miss. That's the biggest difference. Okay, let's put it all together. Motor vehicle crashes are a big thing. Leading cause of all death for people between the age of 5 and 35. Human error causes the vast majority of crashes. Cell phone drivers are 4 times more likely to be involved in a personal injury crash. Their reaction times are slower than 0.08 blood alcohol level. Hands-free is as dangerous as handheld, causes this thing called inattention blindness or tunnel vision, where we're looking but not seeing. 37% reduction in the part of the brain we need for the task of driving, and cell phone use is involved in 1 out of 4 crashes, 24% of all crashes. It's pretty compelling when you put it all together and look at it that way. And think about it again, I keep pointing out, there's no bad guys in this story. You know, this is something, we built these things as car phones. We thought it was wonderful. We had no idea that it involved this much risk. We're learning that today. What's the public think about this? I've been watching, I used to do some research and I did a lot of public opinion stuff, so I've been kind of watching this for years. It's really interesting how quickly public opinion is shifting on this issue. The Quinnipiac University study in November 2010, over a year ago, this was a statistically significant random sample done of American voters, U.S. voters throughout the country. 63% in 2010 favored a total ban, including hands-free, on cell phone driving. Nationwide insurance study, again statistically significant. It was done with drivers, not voters. About a year earlier, 57%. That was one of the first ones we saw that was over half. Public opinion on this issue is changing quickly. And it's changing because people see the bad behavior on the road. And I'll tell you something, folks, for those of you who still use your cell phone while driving, I would encourage you to, it's kind of hard to make the decision to stop forever, but quit for a month. And do whatever you have to not use your cell phone for a month. And I think you'll experience several things. One of the things you'll experience is you'll really notice how bad other cell phone drivers are. You're missing a lot of that now if you're using your phone while driving. This isn't a major corporate website. I just want to read pieces of it here. It's a major corporate company has this site up right now. It says, scientific research on the subject of wireless phone use in driving has been conducted worldwide for several years. According to the National Highway Traffic Safety Administration, the available research indicates that using a wireless phone while driving degrades a driver's performance, whether it is a hands-free or handheld phone. They go on to say at the bottom, for your well-being and the well-being of those around you, you should consider turning your phone off and allowing calls to go to voicemail while you're driving. Who do you think says that? That's on Verizon's website. There must be some truth to some of the stuff we've just been talking about. Okay, I'm going to leave you with a few takeaways, and then I'm done. I'll be happy to answer questions either now or later. We need our full attention for the task of driving. You know, as long as we share the roadways with others, and as long as this is such a huge killer, not only in America but throughout the world, and as long as human error is the #1 reason for crashes, when we're driving a car, our primary responsibility has to be driving that car. Not updating Facebook, not trying to close a real estate deal or have an argument with your spouse. It needs to be driving that car because we're risking everybody's lives around us. This isn't a personal rights and personal freedom thing. This is a lot more than just hurting yourself. You're hurting other people. Nobody has the right to do that. Hands-free is not risk-free. In fact, the vast majority of the research says there's no difference whatsoever between hands-free and handheld. Multitasking is a myth. We don't do it well. We toggle tasks. We go back and forth from task to task. We don't work on two tasks at the same time. And then really key, risk exposure is why we're talking about cell phones. There's so much of it. It's an epidemic that's come upon us really, really fast. Okay, thank you. That's all I got. I'd be happy to take questions now or later.
How about later? Mr.
Okay,
Teeter, thank you
sounds
so
good.
much again for offering your expertise to Evanston on the issue of distracted driving. We have a number of speakers, and if you don't mind, the reason why Mr. Teeter's here is because I don't have all the expertise on this. So we have Sergeant Thomas Moore, who can answer questions, I'm hoping, about enforcement and crash data from the last 2 years of our handheld ban in Evanston, and then Mr. Teeter about some of the distraction issues, cognitive distraction issues. So, Mr. Schoolmaster, what we found is that we have a lot of really great local expertise, and Mr. Schoolmaster, I discovered, is one of our experts. He is with the Northwestern Center for Public Safety, but he is not here in that capacity, rather as a longtime former police officer for both NUPD and Evanston Police Department, is now a crash investigator. So, thank you, Mr. Schoolmaster.
Thank you, Madam Chairman. The comments I make here will be strictly my own. I have devoted, I'm in my 30th year as a senior lecturer at a nearby university that teaches this stuff all over the world, and we've even done some courses for the National Safety Council once upon a time. I was involved with this with policing. I have taught crash investigation in most every state in this country. I've spent well over a year in Africa in various countries teaching over there. We're looking at some things dealing with this in Doha, Qatar, coming up very soon, and we've been keenly aware of this. If you look in your literature, one of the premier experts on this is a gentleman named Jeff Mutart, who is teaching his course for us the second time during this week. I tried to drag him along tonight, but no luck. But if you have any burning issues you need to know about, this man has probably done more research than any other single human being alive on this, including the eyeball gaze cameras and everything. And everything you said was right on. That normally you have a scan of about 15 degrees. Here when you're looking, if you're lucky, when you're on the cell phone, that closes to a 3-degree cone. So you don't see anything coming from the side, and you may not even see the stuff ahead. And it's been shown with these cameras of what people look at. This hands-free is certainly a myth. A couple organizations I belong to, I'm a charter member of the Illinois Association of Technical Accident Investigators, and I'm on the board of directors and a member of the Midwest Association of Technical Accident Investigators and the National Association of Traffic Accident Investigators and Reconstructionists. These are police officers, insurance industry people, engineers. Nearby, we have taught all the engineers for the Big Three automotive and other places, and we just see this continually is a problem. Hands-free is definitely a myth. It tells the public that it's okay. If you're going to allow hands-free devices, it says it's okay. Many, many studies have shown that that's not the case. So this is not only a public safety issue, this is a public health issue. And one of our current problems is the underreporting in crash reports. I worked on a NHTSA grant last year for the city of Chicago to help improve that. The question came up, is it any worse than a conversation with a passenger? It depends on how old you are. If you're under 21, it's not the same as a conversation there. It's exponentially worse. If you're over 65, it turns out it's a little better. But how many people over 65 are actively using cell phones while they're driving? So most of the people that I work with, and I personally urge that you approve any ordinance that limits the use of distractive devices. Previous bans we've seen in various other states and Canadian provinces and European countries. There was a spate in 1999 to 2000, and there was a little break, 2003 and 4. There are a couple issues with the way this ordinance is written, and I've talked about them with the chair, and I hope you will consider them. The one is, I think the way you've defined things and everything would as written, severely limit the use of portable radios and other devices for public safety people. I know they have enough distractions in their vehicles as it is, but sometimes they need to do that to do their job. I was there and I know. So hopefully that can be cured. I would also, you might want to consult with the FCC. There may be some issues about enforcement with people who have land mobile licensed radio devices. That may be only to the FCC. I think you're very generous with your fine schedule. I wish you'd maybe get in sync with some of the other states and Canadian provinces. This is about safety. It's not about the money, but you know if you're going to change behavior, sometimes it has to be about the money. New Jersey, New York, most of the Canadian provinces, you're looking at $200 to $400 fines and points on your license. And this is what it takes, and insurance surcharges, and if this is what it takes to turn behavior around, I think we need to look at it. I think this $50 fine is, but whatever works out for you. I'd be happy to answer any questions later on. I do support this full ban, and most of the folk that I work with continually do that as well, and most of the things were laid out were just absolutely excellent in Mr. Teeter's presentation. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Schoolmaster. The next three speakers, Ms. Cornu, Mr. Shapiro, and Mr. Bova.
Hi, my name is Barbara Cornu. I'm from Active Transportation Alliance, and we are the advocacy group that works on behalf of people that bike, walk, and take public transportation. We work to reduce crashes, injuries, and fatalities. We work to make the streets safer for all, people between 8 and 80, people with disabilities, people on bikes, people that are walking. There's a policy called Complete Streets, which really codifies this, and communities across the state are picking this up. Crashes are no accidents with laws such as this distracted driving ordinance, stepped up enforcement, improved street design, and increased education. We can bring down the number of crashes and save lives, which is what this is about. So please turn off your phone. There is no difference between handheld and hands-free. This is all about changing behavior, and cities such as Evanston are the leaders in this whole effort, and we applaud your effort.
Good evening. Ben Shapiro, 150 Dewey Avenue, Evanston. I am a member of the Evanston Bicycle Club, a pedestrian, and an owner of cars, so I see this from all the different perspectives. You've seen the numbers, you've heard the discussion on the numbers, so I'm going to skip the statistical part of this and tell you a story. I had a friend who was a medical library director, very learned guy, and this is back before the seatbelt law came into place. And the big discussion then was, if we passed this law, would there be enforcement? Would it make any change? Could the police be everywhere to make everybody wear their seatbelts? He understood the numbers. He saw the damage when you didn't wear a seatbelt, when you drove distracted. And we had this ongoing argument. I always wore a seatbelt. My parents used to retrofit our older cars with them. One day, he started wearing a seatbelt. And I asked him what changed. And he said, it's now the law. So it's about, in part, with the law, not just changing what we can enforce or collect fines for, but setting in the public space an expectation of what correct and proper behavior is. And I think by enforcing this ban, we set or send a message to the public that what we need to do is be responsible and that this is a dangerous activity and we need to therefore stop doing it. A final little story. As a pedestrian and as a cyclist around town and around the North Shore, in the last 2 years, and I've been watching carefully, almost all of my near misses, somebody cutting me off in the crosswalk or coming within 3 feet, which is the legal passing distance for cyclists, all those drivers have been on their cell phones. Well, there's one who wasn't, and it was a guy I caught up with at a stoplight, and he was drunk. So I strongly encourage you to pass this ban. I think it's the appropriate thing to do, and I think it would make the community safer. Thank you.
Mr. Bova, then Mr. Boyce, Mr. White, Mr. O'Connor.
Carl Bova from 1322 Rosalie Street. Again, the same subject. which I provided to each of the members, and I'll read that almost verbatim. Pardon me if it may sound like there's a little bit of repeat here, but it basically reinforces what others are saying, especially Mr. Teeter. As a professional engineer who has spent many years in all areas of civil engineering, including transportation, I believe that policy initiatives such as distracted driving need to be supported by thoughtful consideration of some of the facts. Some of those you've heard from Mr. Teeter and Mr. Schoolmaster. Distracted driving is not new. Everyone has heard of people eating 3-course meals, reading, and applying makeup while driving. But fortunately, these talented drivers exhibit this behavior infrequently. But the behavior is not safer because of its infrequency of occurrence. But since folks started using clunky mobile phones about 20 years ago, the number and frequency of distracted driving occurrences has skyrocketed. With increasing use has come a corresponding increase in distracted driving affected crashes. Your packet material this evening provides solid and sobering data. As stated earlier, about 24% of crashes involve cell phone usage. The American Association of State Highway and Transportation Officials, AASHTO, the preeminent group of state transportation departments, is in lockstep with a preeminent agency for highway safety, the National Highway Transportation Safety Administration, when it comes to the need to address distracted driving. Data released just this last Thursday by NHTSA shows that an estimated 3,092 fatalities in distraction-affected crashes in the year 2010. That's about 10% of all vehicular fatalities. If one simply divides that number by the number of states, you can see that Illinois, being 1/50 of this, would be roughly 62 people have died directly as a result of distracted driving. To this, one could add many thousands of other crashes that cause personal injury or property damage. The administration, the safety folks, as you've heard earlier, will be continuing research on this subject. While Evanston does have a hands-free cell phone ordinance, it is increasingly apparent that it is wise and safe to extend the present ordinance restrictions to include all types of distractions and all cell phone or other electronic device usage. While the root need for the expanded ordinance may be targeted at cell phones, one ought not create exclusions or exceptions for other marginal behaviors or special user groups, including bicyclists. But that said, I'd accept the proposed ordinance restrictions that target electronic devices simply because it includes a vast majority of occurrences. One may downplay the physical and cognitive distractions caused by cell phone use, but consider the driver who may be approaching an intersection and is bombarded by all kinds of conflicts with other motorists and pedestrians. I do this on a daily basis in my design of roadways. He or she must process and make decisions that require his 100% cognitive attention. By proper design of the roadway, you're giving attention to creating a design that reduces conflicts and result in fewer crashes. All this is for naught when it comes to the use of cell phones. Adding a cell phone conversation to the mix of conflicts for a driver going through an intersection is patently unsafe for all roadway users. Quoting a high official at the National Highway Transportation Safety Administration, quote, "The findings from our new attitude survey help us understand why some people continue to make bad decisions about driving distracted. But what's clear from all of the information we have is that driver distraction continues to be a major problem. We need to maintain our focus on this issue through education, laws, enforcement, and vehicle design to help keep drivers' attention on the road. Lastly, I would like to add that we leave the cell phone home, put it in the trunk, or shut it off and bury it deep in our handbags or briefcases. Let the moment you enter a car be your signal to live without the cell phone. It's just plain too risky to use the thing. Thanks.
Mr. White? Mr. Boyce, you're up.
Good evening. My name is David Boyce, 2149 Gray Avenue. I'm a Professor Emeritus of Transportation Engineering from the University of Illinois at Chicago and an Adjunct Professor of Transportation Engineering at Northwestern University. I've devoted the last 50 years of my life to the study and research of transportation. I'm not an expert on transportation safety, but I do read everything that comes across my desk about transportation safety, and particularly about cell phones. I'm a member of the board of the Evanston Bicycle Club and former president of the Evanston Running Club. I strongly support what you're doing. I was very pleased to learn that 3,000 tickets, if I have the number right, have been given in the past 2 years for use of cell phones in automobiles. I wondered if the ordinance was being enforced at all. And the reason is that very often I take public transportation on Green Bay Road, and one of the things I do while waiting for the bus is count the number of people that go by that are on the phone. And usually it's about 50-50 on the phone. I thought they must not be enforcing the ordinance. So I'm very pleased to know that 3,000 tickets have been given out, and I agree with the statement that the fine should be higher. I've been asked by the board of the Evanston Bicycle Club to draft a statement on this issue. I'm not speaking for the board at this point, but I believe that we will be offering a statement to you. Thank you very much.
My name is Al White. I'm the current president of the Evanston Running Club, and I think my job here is to apologize for all of those of us who have changed our clothes on the way to a run. We won't be doing that anymore in the car. So, but I would like to say, piggyback a bit on what Dave said about observation. Most of my observations come not as a runner because we have the benefit of the path, and we run on the path. We don't go on the streets because we're smart. But when I walk the dog, I do that often, I count the same things that Dave counts. And I was scratching my ear, Dave. It wasn't a phone. And my count, I started this long before I knew about this issue, and I've never been less than 3 out of 10. And mostly it's 50-50, sometimes more, the people that are obviously on a cell phone. So it's an incredibly ubiquitous, and I think your stats, Mr. Teeter, are overwhelming you at the moment because it's not getting any better, it's getting worse. So I'm all for it. This has been a religious experience, I'll tell you, because I was always one of those, well, I've got a hands-free, what the heck? And I'm smarter than everybody else, so surely I'm paying attention. I don't think I am. So that's all I have to say. Thanks.
Good evening, Kevin O'Connor, 1227 and a half, Isabella. A few short comments. I hope that everybody had a chance to see in yesterday's Tribune, front page, big article on distracted drivers. I would like to thank Mr. Teeter for such a fine presentation, Mr. Schoolmaster, and also I think it was Professor Boyce, since you spent a lot of your professionals. One thing that I think about this that hasn't been brought up, and who knows, and yeah, we might want to reach out to the insurance association, is it may result in lower insurance premiums for Evanston drivers in passing this total ban. I don't know where the insurance companies are, but I'm sure that they're paying attention to this because it's costing a lot of money. I agree with one of the previous speakers that the total ban, except maybe for police and fire, the original ordinance back in January 2010, Section C, number 1 said, any person using a mobile telephone or onboard communications device for non-personal use in the course of ordinary business in their employment with a city, state, or federal agency or authority, the provisions of this section shall not apply to. I remember when this was talked about originally, and it seemed at the time it was verbally stating that the aldermen would not be covered by this. So I think that all groups have to recognize, unless it's police and fire and something of that nature of our first responders, that we're all capable and we're all equal of having the same risk towards each other. One other thing I would add is that, and this is not, I'll just mention this, but we live in a town with a university. When I drive, one of the things, especially downtown or on Sheridan Road, with jaywalking, et cetera, is you get students with earplugs in their ears. And I can't tell you, there's no attention. They're in there, and I don't know if the ordinance can be amended to include you shouldn't have that in the car. I've seen people walk into poles. I've seen people trip on the sidewalk. I've seen all sorts of stuff with cell phones, and also when you take away any of your senses, you become dangerous to yourself and to others. Thank you.
Very much. Mr. Katz, Ms. Muno, and Mr. Rizky, please. And then I promise a discussion.
Okay. Hi, I'm Richard Katz. I'm a psychologist. I'm at 408 Barton in Evanston. This has been a big concern of mine for years. I don't have any prepared notes. I can just tell the committee and the audience here, the evidence is overwhelming. We don't need any more research. I'm more concerned with simply having an educational program, and I've spoken with the police chief about this actually several years ago and then again recently. And my current idea about an ordinance is, well, I'll base it on a study I did a couple of years ago looking at tobacco use. And I compared towns that were enforcing their laws with towns that weren't enforcing their laws. And when you enforce a law, the usage goes down. Basically, punishment works, but it has to be really significant punishment. And as Mr. Teat, I think, said, $50 is it isn't too punishing. But my bigger concern, at least here in Evanston, is if it's possible to educate drivers. And I had an idea that one way to educate them would be to present them with a course such as this, sit them in a room and have them watch the slides, but make the education contingent upon getting a city sticker. In other words, you can't get a city sticker unless you take the education, which catches you beforehand. I think catching people afterhand is more difficult. Whereas if you educate people beforehand, at least they know the risks. And that's, if you could have that, thank you. I have no more comments.
Cheryl Muno, 1729 Oakton Street. Mr. Teeter's presentation was certainly compelling. I grew up in an area where curving and mountainous roads were rural. They were the norm. Average speed limits were 55 miles an hour. The motor vehicle's ability to become a killing machine was impressed on us at a very young age through the loss of several family members and friends who died over the years in motor vehicle accidents. To the high rate of accidents that one read about in the local paper made the prospect of getting a learner's permit a very serious affair in my parents' eyes. Lectures were given about the oft-repeated phrase, "It only takes a moment to lose or take a life, and that moment can never be taken back," echoes in my mind to this day. As a community, we owe one another the respect of acting responsibly when operating anything that has the ability to hurt or kill, and this includes our automobile. I don't need a study to tell me how dangerous it is to attempt operating a handheld device while I'm driving. I know how dangerous it is because in the more than 10 years that I've had a cell phone, I've attempted to use it while driving at least 4 or 5 times. Yeah, that's not a lot. The reason it's not a lot is because the few times I attempted to blab while driving, I was uncomfortable enough to know that my full attention wasn't on the business of driving, and that was an accident waiting to happen, and I could hear my parents in the back of my mind telling me someone can get killed. It's been a number of years since the last time I've attempted to drive and talk. My practice is to pull off of the road when I need to make or take a call. This has worked without issue for me, and the reason is simple. Anything urgent is handled quickly, and I get back on the road. Everything else is really just chatter that can wait until I'm not driving, and then I can say it. Responsibility comes through maturity, and maturity is really what will decide this issue. Are we mature enough to recognize the responsible action we should take in this endeavor and amend Ordinance 10-3-13, or will depriving ourselves of our need for immediate gratification cause someone's death because it's just too much to be borne?
Thank you, ma'am. Mr. Rizky? And if there's anyone else who wants to address the committee, please let us know.
Safety is an interesting issue, which I think council members sometimes like to ignore their real responsibilities. I'll just highlight a few items over the years. Back in 2005, I noted at AP&W city workers are working unsafely in an excavation. The staff wrote me a letter, basically, that's addressed to me that made no sense, but one alderman did thank me at the time for my concern, and it could be why I support him today with a yard sign in my yard, but going on, I've seen other city workers riding our streets and sanitation trucks hanging off the side in an unsafe manner. I recall some years back a worker was actually crushed when a truck backed up over him, and we seem to still be practicing this unsafe practice. One of my recent concerns I think you know about is what happened at the lagoon pit. Has the city corrected the valve pit there and fixed it, even though you put it in a capital plan? Is that corrected yet or still not corrected? I mean, the city should start to worry about some of its own safety concerns and problems here, which I find of quite a bit of concern. The other thing that I do find of some disgust is the fact that when you did pass this ordinance, you exempted yourself last time, which I find very disturbing. I'm also somewhat concerned about some of the so-called science behind a little of this stuff about distraction. I mean, I recall several times where I've observed the police creating distractions by basically setting up a trap for seatbelt tickets. I recall a car basically hitting another car in one of these seatbelt traps. And I recall watching another time as I was walking my dog when they had the seatbelt trap, a car running off the curb because as it came around the corner, it was surprised of this distraction. So distractions are very interesting. Maybe the council ought to fund a cognitive study on visual perception and cognitive abilities to use cell phones and read the city budget. Recently, I noticed we might get an answer, did we raise property taxes or not, if we have such a study. It might be a better use of our money than what we just did on Howard Street. Thank you.
Thank you. Mr. Fischel?
Hi, good evening. Tom Fischel, 2519 Ashland Avenue. And I wasn't planning on speaking on this issue tonight, but I've actually got a story that hits right close to home. A few months ago, I was biking up the bike path on the south side of McCormick and was coming up to Bridge Street where the 3 stop signs were. Made eye contact with a woman on a cell phone. Saw she was slowing down. I sped up. She hit me, and I went flying across the street. And if you know going across Bridge Street, you've got more signs of slow down, crosswalk, bike path, and I was fine. There was no, damage, no skin knees or anything. I was so freaked out that I was fine. I just got on my bike and rode away. But clearly that woman had tunnel vision about this big, and she had plenty of room to look around, and she went right through the stop sign and right into me. So, it hit close to home. So I'm grateful that you're addressing this, and it is a very serious issue, having survived it. So thank you.
Thank you. Anyone else? Let's open this for discussion. Any questions for Alderman Tendam?
Thank you. Thank you all for a very interesting, all interesting presentations. Certainly, there's very little argument for not having an ordinance that includes non-handheld devices. I guess my biggest concern and question comes into enforcement. It seems to me we're living in an age where smartphones are becoming smarter and cars are equipped with Bluetooth and things like that, which would really benefit the person with the newest or best equipment as far as not getting being cited for this sort of violation. I'm just wondering what if the policemen or other officials might have to comment about. What is the likelihood of enforcing something that is so discreet as a very smart phone that automatically connects with Bluetooth, and you really don't know if someone's talking to himself or to singing with the radio or yelling at the radio, or I mean, it seems to me it's going to be a very difficult thing to enforce. I'd just like to know a little more about that, and that's my real curiosity.
Just to address that, as you know, our traffic
Introduce
division,
yourself.
I'm Sergeant Moore with the Police Department. Sorry about that. In charge of the traffic unit currently. As you know, we have the motorcycles, which we deploy spring, summer, and fall months, and that is really going to be our primary tool to enforce this. Typically, the people, when they're on their cell phones, as we've heard from Mr. Teeter, have that tunnel vision. They don't even see us riding up on the motorcycles, so we'll count on the fact that in those warmer months, people will have their windows down. We'll be able to listen in, if you will, to hear them. Obviously, in the winter months and the cold months, it'll be a little bit more difficult. But just the hands-free people will be the ones that we'll have more of a problem with. But we're still seeing quite a few of the people still using the handheld version of it.
Great, thank you. Alderman Fisk.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Thank you. I thank you, Alderman Tendam, for raising the question, because I hadn't really thought about that before, of how you do enforce handheld devices when you have Bluetooth in your car. And I think most cars, probably within the past 5 or 6 years, all have that capability. And I'd hate to think that we're listening into people's conversations in their cars and catching them perhaps on their telephones. I mean, they might be talking to themselves, they might be singing along with the radio. If they've got passengers in their car, they might be talking to them. I must say I've got a little bit of, and have had a little bit of a problem with this, because I talked to Alderman Grover about this fairly early on. You know, where do you make the difference between having kids in the back seat of your car bouncing around and telling you what they did during the day, having a passenger in your, riding in your front seat with you? How does that affect you? And thank you for your testimony tonight, that where you don't see a difference between that. But I do see a difference in that. And I see a difference with having a hands-free device in the car, which I don't use. I don't talk on my phone in the car. I rarely can find my telephone. Any of you who've ever tried to call me on my cell phone, it's usually not charged and in my purse buried somewhere. It's true. It's true. But I am concerned about that we're not taking the complete first steps of getting people who are actually on their cell phones, holding their phones to their head, driving with one hand, and clearly distracted when they're driving. And like all the rest of you, I've counted them too, and I find that to be a huge problem. I'm not convinced about the hands-free thing yet. I'm going to have to do some more thinking about that between now and council. And another part of this too is that, all of our cars now, I was at the auto show a couple of weeks ago, all the cars just present to you images of screens and decisions to make, turning on the heat. I mean, everything is screen-related. Everything is visual on the dashboard of your car. And that, to me, is a huge part of this problem. When I'm trying to adjust where the temperature in my car is going or what window is defrosting or whatever, I'm having to look at the screen rather than being able just to turn a knob on. My old cars always had knobs, and I could do that without taking my eyes off the road. So I think the issue is maybe a little bit more complicated. I am going to have to just take another look at the science that you're presenting. I understand the parts of the brain, but I'm not sure that some of that isn't designed, it isn't the complete story. So that's where I want to do a little bit more research on that. At this point, I will be voting against this, but I'm sure it will go to council and we can have another discussion at council about it as well. The other and last point I want to make is that I want to make sure that we stay in sync with the legislation that's moving through the state legislature. I am a little concerned also that we are, with our close communities on the North Shore especially, that each community seems to have different standards affecting handheld or hands-free devices. And I would like to watch that legislation move through the state legislature before we take any more steps here in Evanston. I'm very happy that we have a ban on handheld devices. I think that's very important. I think we need to have another larger community discussion about bicyclists and their use of phones and other devices when they're riding their bicycles, and just a larger issue of safety. A few weeks ago, we talked about speed limits in Evanston. I think lowering the speed limit to 25 miles an hour throughout Evanston would help a huge amount, too. So I think in terms of safety and motor vehicles especially, it's a larger discussion. I'm not sure the pieces all fit together for me just yet.
Alderman Holmes?
Well, I drive a 1997 Ford, and I still have one of those car phones in there because I couldn't get it out, so it's still there. I certainly want to move this on to council for further discussion, but one of the things that I am concerned about is I'd like to hear more about, similar to what Alderman Fisk just talked about, some of the other distractions that you have in your car. I'm one who, if you're ever driving beside me, you'll see me singing because I sing along with the radio. You probably think I'm talking to myself. Or if there's a passenger in the car, I'm engaged in conversation, and I wonder about that. Or the other kinds of distractions that happen. And I think there's research out, if there's research out there on all of this, there's got to be some other research, and I'd love to hear that. I'm going to vote for this because I wanted to move ahead to council. But I really would like to hear some more, just to give us some more information. And I believe it was Mr. O'Connor who talked about the distractions with the earplugs or what are they, the iPods and stuff that they have in your ears, and I often wonder about that because people will walk right into you. But I don't know how we'd ever be able to enforce any of that. But I am concerned about it. And I think it is one of the things that we have to be concerned, but I certainly don't think that we can, I just can't even begin to imagine about enforcement, around that. But if between now and the time this goes back up, when it gets to council, if we could have some additional information, Sergeant Moore, I don't know if this will come from the police department or Alderman Grover, if you have some other resources that could provide us with some additional information, I would really appreciate it.
Sure. We've got Mr. Teeter right here tonight.
Yeah,
so,
I see him. I'm sort of looking at him when I'm talking.
Why don't we ask him to come up and talk to us about distractions? My thinking on the types of distractions is that I'm pretty certain that almost 100% of drivers have a phone with them in a car, but not many drivers have a crying baby in the back seat, and not many drivers are looking to put on lipstick. So we can establish pretty clearly a phone in every car, and 10% of those drivers are using them. So it's a factor. It's a different kind of distraction. It's a different level of risk.
Hey, we've always had distractions in driving, and we always will. I don't think we're ever going to get rid of distractions, and I don't think anyone's ever going to suggest that we outlaw crying babies in cars. I mean, that just isn't practical. the cell phone use and the reason it's such a big issue, well, there's a couple of things. First of all, it's a very definitive distraction. It's a device. It's focused around a device, and we can do something about that. We can pass specific legislation that talks about how we use that device. But secondly, and as I alluded to, and Alderman Grover just mentioned, it's the risk it's the dramatic increase in risk exposure with cell phones that put them in a class by themselves. We were not talking about this 20 years ago because there just weren't many people doing it. Phones were around, but there just weren't many. We can't even measure the number of people putting on makeup. It doesn't happen that often. I mean, when you see it, you notice it and you remember it. But if you do some of these tests that these folks were talking about where you know, as a bicyclist or whatever, you look at intersections, you're not going to see many people putting makeup on. You're going to see, some of you said 50% talking on phones. You know, the numbers, the national numbers seem to be lower than that. But that's why it's such a big issue. As far as other distractions, we have been able to measure some. You saw some of those I put up there, turning around in the seat or reaching for a moving object, swatting a fly or something like that are extremely risky. But again, they don't happen very often. So there are other distractions. There always will be. And in an ideal world, we wouldn't have any distractions while driving. I'm not sure we're ever going to get to that point. But cell phones have become a significant and single event that we probably can do something about. I'll just make a comment on enforcement. I've talked to law enforcement all over the country. And most law enforcement folks will say, if you give me the resources and you give me the law, we'll figure out a way to enforce it. I was reminded of the early days of the drunk driving, before there were breathalyzers, before there were blood alcohol content tests. How could you look at somebody driving a vehicle and know if they were over the legal limit? I drove to Lansing a few months ago, and there was a driver next to me in the fast lane, kept passing me and slowing down and passing me and slowing down. They were on a hands-free phone. They were the only one in the car, and they were talking the whole time. It would have been pretty easy to cite that person. So I think law enforcement, high visibility enforcement. One police department set up high visibility enforcement, and you think everybody would just hang up the phone by the time they pulled up, but they're just so distracted they don't even think about it. They pull up into a high visibility enforcement lane and they're distracted on their phone, they get a ticket. There's one municipality that actually had people sell flowers at street corners. They had cops dress up that way. And so that when the light was red, they'd walk up to the car. People were talking on the phone. They wrote tickets. So there's creative ways to do that, but they need the law first. You know, without the law, we're never going to come up with ways to enforce it. But it can be enforced.
Can I have a follow-up? Do you know, has there been any research done? Like I know a lot of places will have like the carpool lanes where there's only maybe two people in the car or what have you, to look at and see if there's any kind of comparison between, say, folk that have one or two passengers in the car in terms of crashes versus just being in the car by yourself, that kind of thing.
Well, we have real good information on that for novice drivers. For drivers who are in the graduated driver's licensing period, there's a huge impact of passengers in the car. And that's why we try and pass legislation that limits that. They are distracting. Now, what we find is that as we get more experienced in the task of driving, passenger distractions become less and less. It all depends on what's going on, though. If there's an argument going on in the car, if somebody's intentionally trying to distract the driver, it's a huge impact. We don't see a lot of crashes. The number of crashes, one of the things we know for sure in crashes is what time of day it happens, how many people are in the car. With teens, there's a huge issue. The more people in the car, the more crashes, and it goes up a lot. With adults, we don't see as much of that. And again, that's kind of a practical thing. I mean, there's going to be certain risk always inherent in driving. And I don't think we're going to ever say stop taking passengers around because it might increase risk. But you don't have to be on a phone while driving. That has nothing to do with the driving task. Taking passengers is a transportation issue. It's a driving task. It involves moving people from one point to another. There's always going to be some risk until we get crash avoidance technology that might keep cars from crashing into each other. But until that happens, the driver needs to be focused on the drive, and they're not when they're on a cell phone.
Mr. Teeter, there was a question about the evolution of technology in cars. Can you address how that affects just levels of distraction while driving?
There's a lot of debate out there on that right now.
What the recommendations are now?
Yeah. The Department of Transportation just came out on some recommendations that involve visual and mechanical distractions of these devices. They did not address cognitive. We wish they would have, and we're hoping they will the next go-round. This was one of 3 phases, first of 3 phases. The wireless industry, by the way, and you saw the comment from Verizon, the wireless industry used to fight this kind of legislation. They do not anymore. They've decided to stay silent on any cell phone bans, and then they actively support total bans, and by total ban I mean all cell phone use in any means, handheld or hands-free, for teens. They support that aggressively for novice drivers, and they support texting laws, and they stand neutral on everything else. The auto industry is having a little more difficulty with this, and part of the reason is that, you know, unfortunately they build what we ask them to build. I worked for the auto industry for many, many years. Ford was my biggest client for 17 years. They're the best marketers in the world, and they build what we ask them to build. And even though you saw 63% of the people think cell phone drivers are dangerous, a good majority of that 63% are still using cell phones and driving. That's one of the paradoxes of traffic safety, is we all think we're a better driver than everybody else, and we want the laws for you but not for me. So we still see a lot of that, and unfortunately we're a more and more connected society. We are encouraging the auto industry. We're not trying to tell them to stop putting that technology in the car, because we don't think we'll be successful with that, but we're encouraging the auto industry to give us on-off switches. You know, allow employers who are passing cell phone policies that prohibit their employees from using cell phones while driving to turn off the Ford Sync system, which allows hands-free phone calls. Allow parents of novice drivers to make sure that their teen can't update their Facebook status via OnStar while driving down the road. So we're asking them to give us that functionality in a vehicle. They're struggling with this issue. They're getting pulled in one way to do what their customers are telling them to do, and the science is telling them it's really dangerous.
I think Alderman Fisk, you asked a question about where the state legislation is, and we've been 2 years ahead of where the state is right now. We've already had a handheld ban, and the one piece of legislation that's now pending is a statewide handheld ban. So we're already 2 years ahead of the state. And a hands-free ban is, I think, the direction legislation is going, and it just puts us again ahead, I think. And we have done, in the last 2 years since we passed our handheld ban, some really good educational efforts. It included the Distracted Driving Summit in last April, and then in December with the police department we did kind of a targeted enforcement of the cell phone ban in and around the high school being kind of the heart and center of Evanston, and it having lots of novice drivers and parents. And in the 2 weeks of that targeted enforcement that was preceded by emails to the high school community and signs that the high school had made, posted along the perimeter at Church and Dodge, I believe the police ticketed maybe 67 drivers for violation of the cell phone ban in a 2-week time. So that was education followed by enforcement, the same way that we've done with the Distracted Driving Summit. We do have some interesting crash data over the last 2 years, and Sergeant Moore is more familiar with it than I am. Because what we've seen in the 2 years since the ban is our injury crash rates have gone down significantly, and there may be no causal connection between the cell phone handheld ban and a reduction in the crash rate, because I want to give a lot of credit to our traffic unit, but there may be a correlation between the cell phone ban and increased awareness of the dangers and risks of distracted driving. Sergeant Moore?
Right. For 2011, the city observed a decrease of 8.5% in injury reported crashes for the year, and a 17.6% decrease since 2009.
Since the year before the ban. And by my reckoning, that's 60 some fewer injury crashes over those 2 years in Evanston.
Correct.
So the data from 2 years of enforcing the handheld ban and almost 3,000 tickets is all positive. Any other questions? Mr. Teeter's presentation, by the way, is included in the packet, and I do want to include Mr. Bova's letter with the minutes and a letter that we received that I forwarded to you from the National Transportation Safety Board Chairwoman, Deborah Hersman. The NTSB was the...
we got that too.
We got that. It did make it into the packet.
No, but I mean, you received it. You should have received it at home. At least I know I got.
Oh, you got one. You got one at home?
At my
Oh,
house.
very cool.
Where I
All right.
live.
We'll include that in the minutes of the meeting as well, and it's an endorsement from the NTSB on a hands-free ban as well. So what I'd like to do is, Alderman Tenden?
Yes, thank you, Madam Chair. I will vote for this to pass this along to council, although I, like Alderman Fisk, have a lot of questions that I still in my head. I think there needs to be a larger community discussion, and I think the council level will enable that. So I hope this is a lengthy, not too lengthy, but a pretty extensive conversation, and that a lot of the public does get involved. And I would be able to sort out my feelings in that time as well. So I will vote for this.
Is that a motion?
Yes, I will make a motion to pass the ordinance.
To recommend it to council?
To recommend it to council.
I would second it.
All in favor?
Aye.
Aye. Any opposed? One. Thank you very much. Thank you to everyone who came tonight to thank you, Mr. Teeter. I appreciate it. Sergeant Moore, thank you. So from that, we'll move on to the rest of our agenda for tonight. The township bills. I don't see our township officials here tonight. I did have some questions. Were there any questions about the township bills?
Could I make a suggestion?
Oh, it's a holiday.
Today's a holiday?
It's Pulaski Day.
I'm sorry?
It's a school holiday.
But is it a township holiday?
I don't know.
I don't know.
I'm just saying it's a holiday. Maybe that's why they're not here. I just.
Could we have a list of the township holidays, please?
I'm not saying it is. I'm just saying it is a holiday. Just stating the fact.
Okay.
Madam Chair?
Yes, Alderman Fisk.
Could I suggest that we have, that we ask the township to respond to the bills just the same way we do at A&PW, that we can submit our questions early and have a response by the time we get to Human Services, so that in case no one is here, at least we can move ahead with those. I feel uncomfortable paying for township bills when no one's here to answer the questions. We can pull the individual bill off if there's a large enough concern, but...
Or we can hold these bills until till the 19th.
Is that all right?
Sure. Well, they go to council, but I have some questions that I'll put out there on the record so that we can maybe get information by our council meeting, township meeting on the 19th. Did anyone else have questions for the bills?
Oh, yeah, that's true.
All right, so real quick, my questions were about a seminar conference in Virginia Beach, Virginia. Flights, it looked like via Nashville to get to Norfolk, Virginia for a Virginia Beach conference, Nashville, Tennessee. The amount of the total that we spend in the township for accountants, the monthly accounting of looks like $2,500. Is that one of the items that we could consolidate with the city and realize some consolidated savings on that? I'd love to know if the township has spent any funds for legal, staff, materials, printing, postage regarding the referendum, one way or another. And it looks as if we're still paying with Office Depot finance charges and late fees for both the township and the assessor's office. I have questions about that as well. Anyone else? Okay. Great.
So we're going to leave it here, or is it going to go?
Let's move it to council and then communicate to our township colleagues for March 19th. And then we'll communicate to township colleagues. Yes, Alderman Fisk?
Right, but as a practice in the future, I think it's a good idea for us to ask those questions so that we're not having to remove this from the agenda at council every time we have a township question on the bills. Mm-hmm. So I think we need to just establish that as our regular practice with them, and there certainly ought to be someone here. I think we can ask them to, if there's not going to be anyone attending Human Services, that they let us know in advance.
Right. Then there will be a vote to move this to council. Is there a motion? Yes.
If I remember correctly, I don't know if it was the last meeting or not, when we talked about the township and because you mentioned Office Depot and the finance charges in terms of looking at the agreement that the city has. So I don't know if that has been acted upon or not, so we should maybe get an answer. While he's coming up, so maybe.
Madam Chair, Alderman Holmes, good evening. We continue to talk with the township. Admittedly, it's been difficult over the last several weeks to get a focus on their staff, and quite honestly, we've put some of this stuff aside until after March 20th. Specific to Alderman Holmes' question regarding Office Depot, I believe we did give the assessor that information about using the city's contract for Office Depot. I'll have to check on the details of that. But this is an ongoing process, and we'll continue to work on it over time.
Great. Thank you, Mr. Bopkowitz. Is there a motion to move the bills to council?
I would so move.
Second.
All in favor? Aye. Any opposed? Next item is communication status report on the Evanston Wilmette Golf Association. There was a report, and I see we have a Golf Association board member, 2 of them, here to answer any questions. I think it's just a report. All right.
Well, there was a request too, and it.
I think that, yeah, that goes to council. Mr. Bopkowitz?
Yes, Madam Chair, members of the committee. As you know, I've kind of been looking after this issue over the last year and a half. You have before you a report from the Golf Association. I think they're making very good progress in trying to operate the course in a more business-like manner, and I think have had good results this past the summer, and I think are making good plans for the future. My question to the committee is the issue of the water. The council has a resolution that was passed through December 31, 2011 to waive the water fees. Those fees continue to increase. It would be very helpful to have direction from this committee and then ultimately the council on where next steps are with the water. Certainly I think that the Golf Association is making progress, and I would be in favor of the council considering a resolution that would continue holding the fees in abeyance. I think we do have to come to the realization, though, that even with the golf course operating at a better stead than perhaps they were in previous years, it's going to be difficult for them to have a financial plan that will repay the city as well as pay for the water going forward. And I think that the sooner that the council can come to kind of grips with this, I don't imagine much is going to change in the future. I think that the golf course will now continue to be run well. It will continue to have challenges. The water bill going away, I think, will be a help to the golf course. I think it's a policy question, however, for the city council. Is that okay or not? As you know, we continue to work under the council's previous direction on some alternate uses using property that the city has control over adjacent. Mr. Gaynor put out an RFP for a midi golf, and we've had, I think, a fair amount of interest in that from private concerns. So that may be part of an overall puzzle. We continue to have conversations between the city and the Golf Association with other interested parties. The golf coach at Northwestern, I think, has been supportive over time and has come to both the city and the Golf Course Association with some ideas. Unfortunately, I think the busyness of everyone's lives involved, those really just haven't come to fruition. But the fact remains that the course is unable to pay for water, will likely be unable to pay for water, certainly, I think, in the near and midterm. And it would be useful from a staff's perspective to get some policy guidance from the council on water, certainly through 2012.
Alderman Fisk?
Thank you. While we don't charge users for our other parks for water, do we?
For the parks, as we are a city park department, so no, we do not charge ourselves for water.
Well, I didn't mean charging ourselves as much as I meant, organized groups that might use our parks. We don't give them a little fraction to cover a water bill. I mean, my point is that In my mind, this golf course has functioned over many, many years almost as another Evanston Park. People love it. I ran into Morty Shapiro there. He's a golfer. His son was golfing. I'm not a golfer, but I am a very strong supporter of open lands and parks. And it's my feeling that we should get our heads around this as another Evanston Park, even though it's being subsidized by golfing fees. As Wally said, I don't think there's a way in the world that these people are ever going to come up and pay this bill or continue to pay bills as they grow and grow. So I think we just have to figure out whether this is something that we can waive for them or not. I would support waiving it and allowing them to move ahead, allowing them to continue discussions with Northwestern University and their golf team, look at other possible ideas for part of the golf course, but it really is part of that wonderful park system that we have that replenishes and refreshes the human spirit as people in Evanston and our very, very urban environment have a chance to take advantage of. So I would encourage the council to think about waiving the charges.
Alderman Holmes?
Well, I think that's a sort of a nice thing to do, but I would love to see some comparison in costs in terms of water with other parks. And I hear what you're saying in terms of the usage of water in terms of the other park versus the golf course, because I don't think the water bills would be, I may be wrong, would have the same amount based upon, I don't think we water our parks in terms of, at least I've not seen anyone out doing Butler or Twigs or, if we do.
It varies widely, and I think
I'd like to see the comparison to all of them then and to see how that would go in terms of the water usage, because it seems to me that these bills are completely outrageous, and I agree with you. I think it would be really, really difficult for the group to pay them, and maybe we have to look at another plan in terms of how that property is used. But I would love to see that before I could even begin to make a vote.
Anyone else?
Yeah.
Alderman Braithwaite, yeah, thank you.
Just a quick question in terms of how we treat our residents. What's the current policy that we use right before we shut off the water to residents? Just to refresh my memory.
There is a notification process. We only do it during a portion of the year. It's not something that's done 12 months of the year, but there is a notice that's made. We try to, make payment plans with folks. We're generally a pretty good steward of the water resource with our residents. That if there is difficulty, we try to work it out. In many cases, with a large rental community, really throughout, people leave a facility if they were responsible for water and the bill's not paid. I mean, those are the kinds of things that we do. But Dave Stonebeck and his staff, I think, have been doing this a long time and are pretty generous, actually, if you compare ourselves with other utilities, electric and gas. With that. And one of my concerns when I brought this forward to the council is that there was an extended period of time with the unpaid water bill at the golf course. And certainly as I've come to learn the situation, it's a different kind of situation. Yeah. But at the same time, I don't have the authority to allow anyone to receive goods and services for free from the city of Evanston without the city council's approval. And so really the goal for me here is to come up with a policy that makes sense. I think Alderman Holmes' questions on water use, in other recreational areas is a good one, and we can work through Parks and Rec and the Utilities Department to get that information. So my goal is that we just come up with something that makes sense so the golf course and the Evanston Wilmette Golf Course Association can continue to move forward. There is money owed to the Village of Wilmette as well, and they have concerns moving forward, and at Alderman Grover's request, Mr. Gaynor and I will be meeting with representatives from the Wilmette Park District over time, since a portion of the course resides in the Village of Wilmette, to try to come up with a more global solution. I think our friends in Wilmette are looking to Evanston for some guidance or some templates as to how we move forward with this. So I think it's just important to put this issue to rest and allow the golf course to do what they do best, and that is to, bring enjoyment to lots of folks during the spring and summer months.
Alderman Grove signed up to comment on
You did on this. Great. Please, you got some quick remarks? Mr. Fischel?
Hi, Tom Fischel, 2519 Ashland. I spent 10 years on the Peter Jans golf board, and my father served on the board. In fact, he was president when they put the water irrigation system in. And it surprises me when we talk about a water bill that we can't pay when we were able to raise golf purses of $30,000 for a Pro-Am that we had that Tim Herron came out and won. And last summer, I was taking the Metro train to downtown Chicago to ride my bike, and I ran into a current golf board member, and talked about the crisis that they were having with the management. And I told him I had a little time on my hands. I'd love to come up and help out with the course. And I offered to work for free. I was going to help get fundraisers and do the things that I had done for the course for many, many years so we could pay the bill, so we're not in the middle of a conversation talking about other uses for the golf course, which makes people nervous. Now, when I had the conversation with Mr. Lasasso about managing the golf course, I didn't hear from him for a few weeks, so I don't know what happened with that, if somebody decided I'd be a bad fit or whatever. But he had commented about the problems with the rumors around the golf course, and I have to tell you right now, the rumors have gone viral with different ideas of what can happen with that property, where the property goes. And the fact that the course owes money to the city of Evanston, that may somewhere on one of those pages of the lease might nullify the lease. So, what I ask right now is whatever this conversation is about this golf course, that it's transparent, it's honest, and the people, because the people worked on the golf course last year, they've been told they don't have a job, and they don't know why. And the only comment I get from Mr. Lasasso was the management of the course has been taken care of. So I'm only speaking on behalf of myself, not to the other concerned residents, but when you hear the conversation of other uses for the golf course and a water bill that isn't insurmountable if that course is properly managed. So I just wanted to say that. Thank you.
Thank you. I think we can all agree that a golf course is the highest and best use for that property along the North Shore Channel. And it's really a matter of finding a way to create a sustainable golf operation there. And if we can do one if we can help create a sustainable golf operation that maximizes how many players we have on the course and how many participants and creates more golfers, as well as maybe pays the water bills, possibly, that would be kind of my ideal. I'm sure once the Golf Association reaches out, it'll find there's a lot of interest in the community in assisting with their plan, including one of our 7th Ward residents who let me know today that she was willing to offer some in-kind assistance with marketing and PR for the Golf Association. So we'd really like to see if we can build a bigger, better golf facility right here in Evanston. And I want to thank the Golf Association for giving us a report, a plan, and some financials, which is more than we've seen, I think, since I've been on the council. It's much appreciated. Mr. Bobkowitz, what are you looking for from us, then?
I'm looking for next steps. It sounds as if one piece of next steps is to come back to the committee with the information Alderman Holmes requested regarding water usage, so I'm happy to do that. I don't think that it doesn't appear that the committee has other direction at this time as far as the rest of 2012 or beyond. Is that correct? You would like to get that information first and have additional discussion?
I think so.
Okay, so if you'd like, Madam Chair, members of the committee, we can come back at your April meeting with that information and continue this discussion. Again, my hope would be that we would get direction from the committee soon, and so that we can bring some resolution to the full council here before too long.
We also, the Golf Association provided us with balance sheets. I'd love also to get information about the operating expenses.
Okay.
Money in, money out, the revenue from parking on the golf course for the football season, which I couldn't find in the packet materials here, and that would be very helpful to know what the season-to-season operational outlook is for the Golf Association.
So we'll be prepared to come back next month.
Can we do that too?
With additional information.
Great. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Yes. Introduce yourself, please.
Sharon Eckersall, 2519 Ashland. I have a question regarding, you're talking about the water usage of the parks. Who pays for the water for the ice skating facility down on Main Street. Is that part of the city budget? Do they pay for it out of their expenses, or is the city paying for it? I would like to know that too, because that's got to be quite a large usage compared to the golf course.
You mean at the Robert Crown Center?
Yeah, exactly.
Mm-hmm.
That's part of it. The ice rinks at Robert Crown are part of a city facility. We pay for the water there. I'm no great expert on gallons used of water for that ice. I mean, there's ice placed down there. It's kept refrigerated. We have a Zamboni type machine that it works to improve it throughout the week. So, but the city of Evanston pays for the water there.
Right. Thank you. Any other questions? Any new business? Is there a motion to adjourn? Motion to adjourn. Oh, we may not adjourn. Ms. Esther, I knew you were there, and I had a note, Ms. Esther. Then you tuck behind the. Yes, Ms. Esther. Yeah, she did. May I see the sign-in sheet? Yes, ma'am.
Okay. Well, I did sign in properly. My name is Betty Esther. I stay at 2031 Church Street. I want to give a public announcement, and that is on March the 7th, which is Wednesday, here at the Civic Center in this room, the electors of the township will be continuing a meeting from February the 22nd. It will be held here. The continuation meeting will be held here at the Civic Center at 7 o'clock on Wednesday, March the 7th. The meeting on the 22nd was not recorded, taped, video, or sent out to the public. Since most of you here also serve as the Board of Trustees, I am asking that the meeting on the 7th be televised so that those that cannot get up and come out to the meeting could see it at home. And if you are talking about engaging the people in the community, a few electors did do the proper thing to become engaged in a process of something that is being put on the ballot and everything. And I thought it was misfortunate that, and kind of curious, that it wasn't televised. So if we're saying that we are transparent, then whatever the electors say, we should have that out there also for the wider public to see. So March the 7th here at the Civic Center will be the continuation of the special township meeting called by the electors, a group of electors, not all of them. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Esther. There's a motion to adjourn? So moved. All in favor? Aye. Aye.